All right, Scott, thanks for joining us on an N of One. As you know, this is our chance to talk to behavioral scientists one-on-one because we spend all of our time looking at groups of people and trends and analyses across how do we change entire populations' behavior, but there's still a lot of value in individual stories. And so we love talking to very senior behavioral scientists like you. Thanks for coming and joining us on the show.
Thanks. It's really a pleasure. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be fun. So the way that we typically do this is we're going to start at the very beginning. So I want to talk about young Scott Young, which
Okay.
is a good.
Nice bring to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like it's like a '70s rock band. Young Scott Young. I feel it's like
Path not taken. Yeah.
Crosby, Stills, and Nash. Young Scott Young. Let's talk about '70s Scott. Right? Take me back to the 7-year-old young man out there in the world. Like, what were you like as a kid? What do you think you wanted to do? Like, if others would have described you, how would they have described you?
Very much a sports kid when I was little. You asked me what I wanted to do at 7. Others were thinking fireman and, astronaut. I was probably thinking taking over from Tom Seaver on the Mets or possibly figuring out a way onto the pro tennis tour. That kind of stuff, basketball, etc. Sadly, my athletic talents peaked right around 8th grade, so I kind of learned somewhat early that that was not going to be a career path. But that was really, I'd say my obsession when I was a little kid, and in school as well. I mean, I just loved reading, writing. That stuff came easily, and I just kind of gobbled that up.
So you get to 8th grade and you realize, well, I'm probably not going to be the next, Seaver. Like, where did your mind go from there? As you got a little older, you start to think about high school and stuff. What was resonating for you as you start to figure out, like, hey, sports might not be the thing for me?
Yes. Gosh. Um, I guess a couple of things were going on, really. One, um, my father was starting up a business, so that was always in the background in our lives. And it was interesting to me, although I think consciously or subconsciously, even though I was, helping out in the back room and going to the holiday parties, with the 10 employees or whatever at that point. Um, I think I had always felt like this isn't something I want to do immediately, for a variety of reasons, just be good for me to try out other stuff.
When you say, clarifying question, when you say, I wouldn't
Yeah,
want to do this immediately, do you mean entrepreneurship? Do you mean taking over the family business?
more the latter. Yeah, like literally.
Got it.
I mean, on
Specifically,
the
I
one
don't
hand,
want
it
to do
was,
this,
yeah,
but like business might be interesting, entrepreneurship might be interesting for me at some point, but maybe not taking over my dad's thing.
exactly. Although I'll definitely speak more about that later, since that is ultimately the path I went down. Yeah, I think it wasn't like, boy, I'm going to grow up and do that, or at least not do that immediately. But that was always there, and that was interesting to me. So this world of business, and I kind of had a um, positive vibe or thought around it. It wasn't a negative thing seeing my dad try to build something from scratch.
Go through this entrepreneurship thing.
And then I was just always very interested in history and people. I don't think I would have called it psychology at that point in time, but certainly trying to understand world events and things of that nature. And frankly, I went to one of those high-pressured suburban high schools where, it's just about getting into a good college versus, really thinking about why and what your actual goal of doing so is. So I think it was always assumed that I would do something liberal artsy because that was again more natural to me and perhaps more interesting to me than some of the hard sciences or maths.
Do you remember, double click on that? I was going to move on, but now you said something interesting, so we got to double click on that. Talk to
Sure.
me about like when you remember not being as interested in the hard sciences or the math part of it.
Oh yeah, no, that was easy. I think it was definitely calculus. Um, I mean, again, stuff came relatively easy to me, like SAT type math and so forth. And then I guess it may have been sophomore year, I was suddenly in the AP calculus and I'm like, oh my God, I don't understand what the hell is happening. And that was kind of that was it was a different feeling for me. And yeah, I guess I could have used that as a spark of, wow, I'm going to dive in deeper and so forth. But for better or worse, I kind of used it as maybe this isn't really my area. Again, I was always more comfortable and enjoyed um, reading and writing and bigger picture stuff, I guess, kind of trying to analyze kind of some of the what and why, which again probably ultimately led me kind of down the path that I went.
Got it. That makes a ton of sense. And calculus is a point where like it starts to get a lot more theoretical, right? It's real. So you
Yeah.
start going, I don't know how I'm ever gonna apply this to anything, right? Whereas like algebra, you're like, I might use this. This
That
could
I could do. Yeah, no, and the other kids in the room, they did seem to be getting it. And then to be fair, they helped me. Some of my friends helped me, etc. But I was suddenly like, wow, I'm really this is not coming naturally to me. This is hard stuff. And again, it also wasn't intrinsically interesting to me. I think if it had been more applied, I probably would have been able to grasp it more. And again, see the point of diving deeper into it.
so this applied theme starts kind of early.
I
Um,
think that's fair. Yeah. I think I was and remain, I think, for better or worse, a little more practically minded or application minded than theoretically minded. And I'm not sure that was conscious at that point so much, but it definitely started to manifest itself more and more as my life and career went on.
and so then you go off to Duke. You talked about going to a high pressure suburban school and getting into a good school. You did get into a good school and you went off and you studied poli sci. Was that like, I know what I want to do and I know it's this? Was that a like, I threw a dart at a dartboard and
Um,
poli sci came up? Like, how explicit and conscious was that sort of as a choice?
Somewhere in between. Definitely areas that I was interested in, and I think it was pretty obvious to me, and Duke as well is probably more liberal arts oriented versus pre-professional. So, the difference between getting a philosophy major and a history major and a poli-sci major, probably not that big a deal in terms of career prospects. But it was an area of interest, and also probably the bigger change point for me as well was going to London my junior year to LSE and really kind of essentially opening my eyes to the world. I hadn't, while we were certainly comfortable growing up, we weren't globetrotting, etc. That was probably my first time outside North America. And, I mean, part of it was perhaps a travel bug, but I'd like to think it was really an interest in cultures and so forth. So that kind of led me to definitely recommit to poli sci and also potentially the idea. And for me, I think the path not taken for the most part, other than the rock band, was foreign service and so forth. And
Hmm.
going down that path, I could have, I think, been happy, or at least, is certainly intrigued with the idea of diplomacy, etc. And one thing that I've been really thrilled about with my career is that it did ultimately end up becoming so multicultural and just the opportunity to work in and with people from different countries, in different places, etc. So that was probably a bigger turning point for me than anything else, I think.
Let's double click. You said something interesting in there about the path not taken. If it hadn't been poli sci, do you have it sort of would have been a related, as you pointed out, at a liberal arts school, the differences are small. Was there a like, I might be an English major kind of version of Scott going on, or you kind of knew it was in this clustered?
Actually, I think it was, if anything, it was probably a little more towards the policy side. And in retrospect, I probably could have and should have been a public policy major, because I think that would have combined some of my interests in the poli sci with a little more substantive, perhaps a little bit more quantitative look at things. Um, but one thing that does stand out, and kind of relates to behavioral science, behavioral economics, is that one of my stronger memories academically from college was sitting in some of those intro econ classes and just thinking this is nonsense. Not that this is difficult per se, but some of these assumptions are silly, about all the things about macro and microeconomics, and that you're generalizing to a ridiculous degree, and just common sense tells me that's not right. Now, this was well before largely before certainly I had any access to behavioral science, behavioral economics thinking. But I remember that was a strong takeaway. And my answer at that point was, I'm not going to go down that path because I really, you know, it's not that it's overwhelmingly difficult. I just don't find it very valid, and I don't want to spend my time making assumptions about humans that I kind of know at face value don't make sense.
Yeah, there's sort of this intuitive wrongness part, without outing your age, situating this for our listeners, it's sort of in the late 80s. So you're right, this is not
Yes, that's fair.
Kahneman and Tversky are not, you know,
They're out there,
but they're not
I found them.
mainstream, win a
Yeah,
Nobel Prize, everybody reads them, it's a core part of the curriculum kind of stuff.
yeah,
This is still very traditional macro, micro, Hobbesian sort of economics. Uh,
exactly, exactly.
yeah. And so why LSE? Why London?
Because in addition to having painful times in calculus that I mentioned, foreign language was also never my gig at all. And to my day, I regret to this day, I should say, I regret that. But talk about nonsense. I also felt like sitting in a classroom twice a week trying to learn French, in a non-immersive way was useless, and it kind of turned me off. And and in hindsight, it would have been by far the best thing would have been for me to go to a place like Paris or elsewhere, and spent half a year diving deep. But at that point, I was kind of turned off to it, and London seemed to make sense. But I will say as well that LSE in particular was intriguing to me, given not just my major, but my real interest in poli sci and so forth.
Yeah, and they do have a much, they do a better job than many schools at being applied, right? There are many schools of thought where there's just sort of a theoretical bent, and LSE has done a marvelous job over the last 30, 40 years of really being a place where we're getting into stuff and we're doing stuff and we're making policy and we're setting things and, in a way that,
Very much. And I do see that, even now with my engagement at LSE many, many years later, with the PBS program there, I do see that, and I'm excited to be part of it. The fact that they are living very much in the quote real world, and trying to apply it.
and so then you graduate, you come out of Duke,
I do
like, what
indeed.
do you,
Yeah.
if I had asked Scott, the senior at Duke, what are you going to do next year? Like, where does he think his life and career are going?
Well, as I mentioned, I think there was kind of a twofold path. There was either this intrigue and idea of foreign service, and I think maybe if I'd had again the benefit of hindsight or more guts, it was 1989. I will out myself on age, which would have been in hindsight an unbelievable time to have just gone to Eastern Europe and watched you know watched those developments and maybe figured out a way to be part of them. Um, so that again was the path not taken. But I was intrigued in the business world. I didn't see myself as an academic. I definitely didn't have a desire to go to law school or just to continue a purely an academic path. So, it turned out into a couple of different paths. Consulting was very intriguing to me. Maybe because it's the refuge of those who don't know exactly what they want to do, and exposure to a lot of stuff at age 22. But I ended up going to kind of one of those management development programs, and actually it was a positive experience. I spent about 3 years doing different things at Prudential. And while financial services was, in hindsight, a poor choice, not a well suited to me, it was a good experience in all. And actually, I had a wide, nice range of experiences there, from working in the community in Newark in what's called the Public Affairs Department, which was more about volunteering and volunteerism. So there was kind of a nice public nonprofit side to that, to working at the mutual funds people, very much marketing and, you know, more classic business, I suppose. Down on Wall Street or in the South Street Seaport area down in Lower Manhattan. So it was a good experience for a couple of years, but I did realize that that wasn't, I didn't want a life in insurance and financial services.
And
It just wasn't me.
was that fairly immediate? Like in your first week, you're like, this is a thing that I will do for a time, but it's not going to last? Or was that a gradual realization over the course of?
More of a gradual realization, actually. Because actually my first assignment was more of that community engagement in Newark, and I really enjoyed that. Once I got closer to the core business itself was kind of where I felt like, again, nothing against it and nothing against the people there, but it just didn't really excite me. I don't know if it's a need to be more tangible or whatnot, but in any case. And I also had a really interesting interlude there, which Prudential was willing to accompany or accommodate, which was trying to think of a quick way to explain this. But the quickest version is I went to and I lived and I did an internship in India for about 4 or 5 months, through an organization that I was involved with in college. And that came through after I had graduated. And we kind of negotiated that I could take a leave of absence for 6 months and live and work in Mumbai. And it was also in financial services, but it was a very, as you might imagine, a very different and a very interesting experience. And I'd like to think that that's helped me just broaden my perspective in many ways, and helped me, through my career.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a ton of sense. Um,
Well, I was the one American in a room of 40, people from Mumbai in an office, probably an office that should have had about 15 people with about 40 in it. So, I think that experience of being the minority, of being the person that everyone looks at twice or makes assumptions about and so forth, I think it can only help you, just in terms of understanding perhaps a little better what other people may be going through, and just pushing yourself to think a little differently.
and I think the reason I said it makes sense is I think that this is the theme that will come up again and again throughout our conversation about your career, because there is this sort of theme of, how do you take an outside in approach to understanding something and the value that that perspective gives you.
Yeah,
You finish
definitely.
up and potentially go off to an MBA. What
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about sort of what that decision was like in retrospect, like good, bad, indifferent. Like, tell me a little bit about going through that experience.
Well, I think after about 3 years, both the India experience, but also the time at Prudential, I had come to, I think, realize that I did probably want to at least give a try to going into my family business and working with my father. Um, which, giving away the punchline a little bit, what turned out to be a terrific decision on multiple levels. And I think, again, the feeling I'd had from the very beginning was I don't want to do this right away. I want to both satisfy my own curiosity about other things out there, but I also would like to be able to bring something to it,
Mm.
and I think the MBA to some degree was an opportunity to do both. Both to kind of confirm are there other things out there that I want to try and want to do, but also perhaps to bring a stronger, a different base of knowledge, or at least awareness, if I do end up joining a small business and trying to grow it. Um, and the MBA experience was great. I mean, it was certainly great socially. Met my wife as well, which is nice. But it was good in many ways. I wouldn't say it was the most rigorous, difficult 2 years of my life, or a year and a half of my life. Um, but it did, again, broaden horizons a bit, put me into contact with some great people. And yeah, and again, kind of gave me time to prepare actually. One of the, some of the special projects and so forth, I started turning towards thinking about my family's business and what could I bring from some of the courses I was taking, whether they were in management and operations and so forth. And, could I bring some of that thinking back? And how does it make sense for a small business?
And you're reading my mind because, you came into business school with this value proposition that is like, hey, this will be a last, chance at doing some experimentation. And if I do go back to the family business, I'll be bringing something back. Do you feel like it helped you do that? Do you feel like it was a good preparation for going into the business, or do you think those 2 years would have been better spent being in the business and sort of?
No, no, no. I do think it was good. I think it was good in multiple ways. I think there are differences, certainly. While you have a lot of team-oriented projects in a business school environment, and Kellogg, where I was, emphasized that. Um, I think in retrospect, the reality is you're dealing with a lot of people that are somewhat similar by definition, right? I mean, they may come from different backgrounds and have different interests and skill sets, but they're motivated young people, who have the opportunity and maybe the privilege to be able to be there. And then you go into a business and some people may fit that mold a little bit, but there are a lot of other people coming at it in very different ways. Some and I don't mean this in a negative way, but they're just trying to do their job and not bring it home in any way, shape, or form, right? They just want to be there and get things. So learning to motivate and work with people that may have very different expectations about what work is and what it means, and that aren't necessarily, you know, the MBA types. I think that took some time. But as a long-winded way of still saying that I do feel like it was a good experience. It exposed me to a lot of different resources and ways of thinking that I don't think I would have had if I, jumped at age 25 into a business.
And I think you bring up a nice point about sort of maybe the expanded definition of cross-cultural, right? We often think about cross-cultural in terms of like countries or ethnicities or sort of other sorts of cultural forms, but it is very different to be the only MBA trying to work with a bunch of people who maybe don't have the same educational background or the same career goals or the same,
Yeah,
what
same
they want their.
aspirations. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and
100%.
yeah, and many of them have very different constraints and challenges and home issues and all of that stuff. So, I think having sensitivity to that is part of being a leader, and it's not necessarily about just recruiting superstars and so forth. It's, maybe this may sound a little trite, but, just trying to help everybody be the best version that they can of themselves that they can be. And yeah, well, I alluded to, I mean, going into my family's business was really just a great decision. I mean, I think it was a high risk decision in the sense that, working in a small business with your family, can either be great or terrible. Um, I would say great for me, and I give 95% of that credit to my father, because, inevitably he's the one that was there and setting the tone.
Hmm.
And you might think someone who started a business, you know, is going to be protective or defensive or whatever. And he was the opposite. He was very much, hey, you've got this fancy MBA thing, and gave me a lot of space to fail, frankly, in some respects, or to make decisions, some of which worked and some of which didn't. And also just a pleasure to be around and, an easy person to work with, and a good combination of both mentoring, but also, as I said, giving me space. So, really the majority of my career, 20 plus years, 25 years, I think, I guess, was really growing a company. There was probably about 30 people local when I joined it into a global company, with off about 6 or 7 offices around the world, um, and that ultimately could serve as a big partner to a lot of the big global marketing companies, the P&Gs and Unilevers of the world. And I think it also helped that I really was truly interested in what we were doing, which was the consumer slash shopper research. And I'm not positive I went into that business knowing that, boy, I'm passionate about understanding and unlocking decision making. Um, but as I got into it, I really did find, like in the same way I found financial services wasn't a real passion, to be honest. Here, I found, intrinsically, I really was interested in the individual studies we were doing, not just the challenge of managing and growing a business.
Well, and there are seeds. That's why we start young, right? There are seeds of that earlier. There's the
Yes.
rejection of calculus as not applied enough. There's the embracing of sort of poli-sci, and particularly the policy part of that is like, hey, I want to be effective in a particular kind of way. There's the LSE experiences, and even what you
Yeah.
gravitated towards at Prudential, right? Sort of set you up for succeeding in this way. As you came into the business, how is your role scoped, right? So you come in, dad's been running this here, but like,
Yeah.
what is he looking, I appreciate you talked a little bit about autonomy and accountability, right? He's holding you accountable for particular outcomes and he's giving you the room to make mistakes. We know that's a successful formula.
Yes.
What was your initial accountability? If you sat down at the end of year one and dad said you did a good job or not a good job, how are you deciding what that was in the context of this shopper research, consumer insights sort of business?
Yeah, well, actually, and again, whether this was conscious decision or kind of stumbled into it, I really dove right into the actual work itself, rather than just being kind of a shadow CEO or whatever. I mean, I really pretty much started as a focus group or qualitative moderator, um, which on the one hand, is a rough life. I mean, it's a good life if you're 27 or 28, Atlanta on Monday, Chicago on Tuesday, Dallas on Wednesday, and then home to write the synopsis. But that was a big part of it. And then also we did a lot of quantitative survey research and all, ultimately that would turn into reports and usually going to clients and presenting the findings and discussing them. So, 6 a.m. to Minneapolis, do the 3 hour meeting, find
Come
another
back
client
again.
in Minneapolis if you can, and then come home. So it was actually it was good in multiple ways. I mean, I think it gave a real understanding of the business, a hands-on understanding and knowledge. And I think as well, it probably ultimately gave me credibility in the eyes of others, who I'm sure could say, who is this kid just kind of walking in, all that. So I ended up doing that in varying ways for a good 10 years or so, where, the majority of my work was, client A, client B, project A, project B, and it was more on the side, maybe advising or speaking with, my father and others, making some decisions about, hiring and more strategic type decisions.
But this is also an interesting 10 years in the insight space, right? There's a move from, sort of per call to an increasing amount of quant, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
The internet's coming about, which is a huge change in like how we gather and look at research. Computing in general is, expanding, which is a huge difference in how we start to look at research. Talk me through some of the like, how did you adapt what you were doing as a frontline researcher and presenting these insights as this world is sort of coalescing around you. One of the things that comes up on the podcast sometimes because we do get, I try to talk to people from a variety of different seniority levels, and it's interesting to talk to somebody like Pete Judo, who's like, yeah, I went to school as an undergrad to study applied behavioral science, which of course to you, someone like you and I, unfathomable,
Not a
didn't even
thing.
exist, right?
Yes.
Nobody was
Yeah.
using those words. That was not a thing that you could do, right? So talk to me a little bit about sort of this evolutionary part of your work as the discipline really changes around you and you're part of that change.
Yeah, well, actually, I'll give you a slightly different angle first, and then maybe what you've related to, I would probably argue was maybe after those 10 years and kind of towards the second half where you did start seeing many different types of changes. I think doing research, both qual conversations, IDIs, mini groups, whatever it was, and quant And I should mention, our work was a lot around packaging and shopper marketing and the presentation of a brand in a retail environment, et cetera. I think what became clear, and to be fair, was kind of clear to my father, even going further back, was just the limitations of asking people questions, right? The fact that, they would try to please you and struggle and give you wonderful answers. And then, you'd go and do a quant study and simulate the introduction of a new packaging system or a new product. And the behaviors would be completely different than what somebody, what many people would tell you in an hour-long conversation. So, to me, and in fact, one of the things that we did as a company was start to pioneer the use of eye tracking technology and some other tools that were trying to get at essentially subconscious system one level behaviors that people weren't able to articulate.
Mm.
So to me, a lot of this really was the roots of my interest in behavioral science, or at least one aspect of that was, starting to see stuff that was not yet in books, or at least books that I was aware of, but starting to see some of those limitations. And a lot of the innovation we were trying to get at was um, not relying on claimed behavior, not relying on solely on direct questioning. What would you do if this product was available? But
I'd
instead,
buy it, Scott. Of
yeah,
course I
exactly.
would.
But instead, simulating scenarios and seeing how people behave. What they choose, what they do, what they see, what they miss, what they pick up, what they ignore. Um, so I think it really shaped me and ultimately led towards my fascination with behavioral science. Um, and I guess if you don't mind, I mean, to jump ahead a little bit, it was kind of a confluence of events that ultimately led me to make the transition from what I would describe as consumer shopper research to applied behavioral science, to full-time focus. And, part of it was this kind of seeing through experience of this gap between claimed and actual behaviors and so forth, and the limitations of asking questions. And part of it is some of the things that you were starting to speak to of how the research industry itself was changing. Um, in some ways that were positive, no question. The data that was available, but in some ways, frankly, that I felt less excited about. Which were just constant pushes towards cheaper, faster. Kind of a feeling that the data could replace primary research.
Mm.
And I would try to gently say, look, data tells us what people have been doing, and that's wonderful and that's relevant, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what people would do in new scenarios. And we need to find the right balance between informing ourselves with data that's available, but also constantly simulating and trying and testing and learning. Um, so the very quick story I tell, much quicker than today, is that, when the literature did start coming out, roughly 15 years ago, I would say, with Thinking Fast and Slow and, Predictably Irrational and all of that, um, it completely resonated for me. It kind of was very much, this is what I've been saying and thinking. However, in uh, a more rigorous, academically grounded way, perhaps. Um, but it's a lot of what I've been seeing and a lot of what I've been saying. So I was gobbling that up as it came out, and at first really using it to try to continually refine the research we were doing. So it was really applying behavioral science to the primary research we were doing. What questions can we ask? What questions should we not ask? Because we know we're going to get misleading answers, etc. Um, and then partially, starting to get me interested, frankly, in applying some of my energies towards broader issues, broader issues of human behavior and behavior change.
Let's talk through some of those pieces. You talk about the sea change of when those books start to come out. Did you suddenly find clients were more, had more context for the things that you'd been saying the whole time, or was it still a lot of pushing the boulder up the hill? Like, did it feel immediate? Did it feel gradual? Like, talk to me a little bit about so much of behavioral science is helping people understand what the hell behavioral science is and why they should be interested in it, right? As with any new discipline.
Yeah.
Um, did that make it easier or did it sort of muddy the waters?
I, if I had to choose one, I'd say muddy the waters, still a lot of boulder pushing. Um, and I guess I say that because I mean, researchers, and I was dealing largely with heads of research at different companies. By nature, they're somewhat conservative folks, right? The rebels don't necessarily end up leading research departments, right? And as much as they say they want innovation, they're also very wedded and tied to norms and the way they've been doing things, which, I guess arguably is human nature overall, but somewhat magnified in a corporate environment. So, I think you could, you could use it to some degree to kind of justify why we were doing things that we've been doing. But the second you tried to get people to deviate and try new approaches, that became difficult. And it was almost always, can we find ways to work this into the work we're already doing, as opposed to, either getting people to completely change a methodology or approach, or frankly, finding larger budgets to do, add-on work. I mean, I think my dream, so to speak, would have been to do more work that kind of started with the research studies we were doing, but then was linked to behavior change initiatives. But that was a very hard thing to do working through the research teams and departments that we were working with. That kind of money and resources tended to sit elsewhere in organizations, if that makes sense.
Were there early deviations, meaning were there clients that you remember not having to push or that were more accepting or more able to see that as like less of
Yeah,
the
and I think there are
seasoning and
also
more of the steak?
areas where you'd have more latitude. Like, a lot of the work we were doing was, frankly, was testing of new products, testing of new packages and merchandising systems and things like that. And there, I mean, by and large, for better or worse, people were looking for, tell us whether it's A or B and whether A is any good. So there wasn't as much latitude. But on occasion, we would do shopper studies that were more broad understanding about, how do people make a decision on how to buy a printer? What's going on at home beforehand? What's going on when they're in a physical environment? What's the interaction between online shopping and physical shopping? So, in those kinds of projects, then you'd have much more latitude, um, because it wasn't really linked to a normative database. It was more about, driving insights. So again, I guess like many businesses, you'd probably, 85% of it seems to feel pretty similar, but then you'd find the 15% perhaps where you'd have more latitude and opportunity, and frankly, I think a little more fun and inspiration.
And for the clients where it did feel easier, was there a pattern or trend there? Like, hey, when I'm working with people who have more exposure to social psych, or I have more people, was there a trend in the rebels, that you found it easier with, or was it just, some people really glommed onto it and made it easier?
I think it's a little more the nature of the organization in many cases. In other words, and I don't say this to demean or criticize, the Unilevers and P&Gs and Kraft Foods of the world, but I think like the larger and more structured the organization, the more they do these things 50 times a year, the more they standardize these things, and then ultimately the less latitude you often get, even if they claim and want, in theory, to do more. Whereas, smaller companies might not have some of those constraints. I mean, they may have financial constraints, but they don't have as many process constraints. So I think I felt it was a later on in my career, I've definitely felt it's more driven perhaps by individuals and certain people who just get it and want to make behavioral science happen in their organization regardless of role. But at that point in that world, I think it was a little more a function of the companies and the structures, if that makes sense.
And then, you know, you're doing this for a long time and you eventually decide to exit the business. I mean, talk to me a little bit about what makes that decision and where you start to decide that like, hey, it's time to go bring that into something larger and different.
Yeah, there was a variety of factors that I think were all kind of a confluence of events, if that makes sense. I mean, on the one hand, as I mentioned, I didn't love, I thought we had kind of plateaued as a company. We had, as I mentioned, really grown really well. We globalized, we became the global partner to almost all of the big FM, fast-moving consumer goods companies. And we reached a terrific place, and that was wonderful. But I didn't see the next place to go, so to speak, without making enormous investments and like kind of changing business models and so forth. Secondly, I didn't love where the research world was going. I think I started to allude to a lot of pressure towards automation and self-serve and faster, cheaper. And some of it, like anything, some of that has a lot of validity. Some of it, I thought they were kind of throwing the baby and the inside out with the bathwater. Um, and I think there was some personal element as well. One, I was becoming more and more fascinated with behavioral science overall. And two, I was like, I've spent a long time, and I'd like to think it wasn't just this, but a more cynical person would say, helping Crest defeat Colgate or Colgate defeat Crest. And, I don't begrudge either of them or the people that work there, but, I'd like to really push myself and maybe apply what I'm doing towards broader issues and challenges. Um, and then, so those things were all kind of coming together around 10 years ago for me. And also, as it turned out, the partner that we found was a company that was a competitor, BVA, or PR, it was called In Vivo at the time. And, in addition to other factors, it was led by Eric Singler. And Eric's side passion, it was almost parallel to me in French form, right? His side passion was applied behavioral science, and he was, uh, his side gig that he had actually started to develop within BVA Group was a consulting organization. So it wasn't the reason we ended up partnering with BVA, but it was certainly a positive on the ledger, so to speak.
The cherry on top of the deal is now you get to do the behavioral science thing that you really love and care about.
Yeah, and where we were competitors, there was a lot of mutual respect, and there's kind of a couple year dance and whatever of make finally having things work out. Um, but the shared interest in behavioral science was definitely a big part of that. And the long story short is we ended up merging the two companies, the U.S. based global company and the French company. And I spent about 2 years managing that. Actually moved to London and kind of managed that. And then ultimately transitioned to join Eric in the Nudge Consulting group, where we were essentially doing applied behavioral science, but to the business community, which was obviously a more natural fit for me, and an area of interest. And also working, instead of working only with fast, consumer goods companies, essentially, suddenly I'm, working in healthcare one day and I'm working in financial services the next day. And I'm, very, very much broader set of issues and challenges, which I think I was just at a point where that was what I was looking for. Um, and it worked out quite well.
One of the things you talked about in there that I think is really interesting is, talked about some dissatisfaction with the commoditization of research and sort of the self-serve nature of research that was happening. It's interesting that you mentioned that, right? Obviously, because we're going through another version of this right now with generative AI, and we're not even going to talk to people anymore. We're going to do research.
Synthetic users, yeah.
AI is going to do research on top of AI, and AI interviewers will interview AI participants, and then it'll all just become one giant chain of algorithms.
Exactly.
Having lived through a version of this, talk me through like what you think made that commoditization happen, where you thought there were benefits, and where you felt like, ugh, man, this just turns me off as an individual researcher.
Yeah. Well, gosh, I'm trying to think of a quick version of this. I mean, I think how it happened was frankly, it was one of those tipping point things where one individual really helped drive it, which was a new person came in to take over the research function at Unilever, which was, one of the biggest and best regarded of the large global marketing companies. And, whereas the previous head, had been all about quality, for lack of a better term, the mantra with the new person was something to the effect of, 80% as good at 50% of the time and 50% of the cost. And on surface, well, that sounds like a good equation. And you could make some arguments that, 80% is good enough to guide some decision making. Um, but you could kind of see where that was going. And it kind of meant a walk away from, we had spent years, doing research on research and trying to prove, the predictive nature of the studies we were doing, et cetera, et cetera. And kind of all of that flew out the window pretty quickly towards, can you take your 6 week study and make it a 3 week study, or your 3 week study and make it a 1 week study? And that mattered more. And once Unilever did it, I think it gave permission, so to speak, to others. And you could see, hey, these guys are spending half as much now, and and the problem is, you don't always see the impact of these decisions right away. I mean, occasionally you have a disaster out there. There's a famous Tropicana packaging change where they managed to lose 100 million in a couple of weeks by completely confusing every shopper in the world. But that's really the exception, right? So I'm trying to think of a quick way to say this, but you could just see all of the energy going in that direction. And again, like most things, I think there was some positive in it. I think there were certainly times that we and perhaps others were spinning our wheels and over customizing and reinventing the wheel each time. Um, but again, it kind of went from 0 to 100. And I think along the way, you did lose something. So whether you were, actually going from 100% accuracy, for lack of a better term, to 80%, or whether you were going from 100% 30% is a little fuzzy. Um, and of course, to some degree, we were trying to help guide, um, and guide, hey, here's where we can trade off and feel good about it, and here's where we don't think you should. One of the most obvious things, for example, was all about web-based versus in-person research. And the answer is somewhat subtle, right? There are some decisions that showing somebody something on a screen is fine, but there's other decisions where not really. There's the environment and the context and the physical dimension and the tactile feel and other things where, it's kind of garbage in, garbage out. So, yeah, I saw that very much in the research world. And I'd like to think the pendulum kind of swings and, you go far in one direction and then maybe recalibrate in the middle. Um, but once clients are used to almost instant data and have kind of taught themselves not to question the data too much, it's very hard to kind of wean them back to, hey, you really do need 4 weeks and 50K to do this right, you know? So that's kind of what we were facing. And again, I felt as though that with the confluence of other events made it the right time to transition for me personally. And there are other people, including some of my former colleagues and friends who are still happily plugging away and have found great solutions and I believe are still reasonably happy in that world. I don't think I would have been. And to some degree, you may be a victim of, you know, of your success, and you were happy and very pleased with what you were doing, makes it that much more difficult to pivot 180 degrees on something.
But then joining BVA, and merging in was an opportunity to do that 180-degree pivot.
I think you ended up muted, Matt. Sorry.
Did it feel as you started at BVA that you got that chance to really be deeply thoughtful and to do that 180-degree pivot that you had been seeking?
Um, Largely, yes. Not so much in the consumer research space. So again, for those 2 years or so that we were merging the companies, it's a lot of internal, a lot of logistical, a lot of management issues. As in any merger, mergers are not easy. Um, but once I did pivot to applied behavioral science consulting, yes. I mean, on the one hand, it was, what's the right word? Unnerving sounds like the wrong term, but it was challenging, right? Because I felt as though I had spent 25 years in a pretty narrow space, and I really, really knew that space, and I felt extremely confident. And then suddenly I'm like, well, observe and speak with oncologists and try to help, you know, modify their decision making as it pertains to cancer related treatments. And you have a little imposter syndrome of, what the hell do I know? Um, and there's definitely a transition there. But with respect to that, I do feel like I was able relatively quickly to realize, hey, I'm not going to be the subject matter expert in the same way that I'm used to. But that's okay, because I am going to bring an angle or a lens to these problems that others might not have. And that's where I'll add something. And combining that with the proper level of respect for the people that really know this stuff day in and day out. Whether it's gender equality and hiring at a bank, or whether it's oncologists and medical treatments, or whether it's you know train conductors and behavior on trains. Just making sure that I'm doing them justice and really listening to the people that are on the front lines every day, um, and not walking in with this assumption that I can solve their problems and I know what they should do more than they do.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point as a behavioral scientist. At some point, as you become increasingly a leader, you'll have people working for you who are better than you at any of the individual parts of behavioral science. That person is a better statistician than I am ever going to be because they're sort of vertically oriented along this thing. And my job as leader has now become sort of horizontally,
Yeah, definitely.
right? And so you're managing experts. You're an expert in the management of experts, which is its own sort of weird meta concept. It
Yeah,
definitely.
and I also, I think there's two dimensions. One is that, as you just mentioned, and then the other, I think, is respecting and tapping into the knowledge of the clients, and not falling into this trap that, I'm the consultant and I'm smarter than you. Yes, I'm a consultant and I'm bringing in an angle and a perspective that might be different. But you who live this day in, day out have perhaps a very different and deeper understanding of the systems and the processes and the way things work. And I'm not here to tell you that's wrong as much as to listen. So I do think the years of being a, qualitative moderator and so forth definitely have helped quite a bit with respect to that. Just let's listen before jumping to conclusions, or observe, and in fact, and before jumping to conclusions.
And always the hallmark of a good scientist, right? That observation is where all the data comes from, right? If we're going to make, assertions, it needs to be based on localized data. You have an interesting distinction of having been one of the few people that has got to work at two really major organizations in the form of BVA and BIT, right? There's not a lot of movement in behavioral science. You don't see a lot of people go from one unit to another. What was it like to switch companies? How did you experience the cultures differently? How did you grow differently at the two places? Like, how did you navigate that change?
It was very different. very different on multiple levels, and frankly, I think more different than I thought it might be. I mean, if I have to summarize it somewhat quickly, I'd say, BVA was a was used to serving businesses, right? So they kind of spoke the language that I was used to speaking, even if it was a little French inflected. It was it was the pace and the yeah, I guess it was the pace and the norms of working with businesses, whether they're, L'Oreal or whatever. Um, and BIT, you know, and there's nothing wrong with it, but they were very used to culturally working with governments, with philanthropies, large multi-year programs. And the vast majority of people, not all by any means, but the vast majority of people were also coming from PhDs or academic backgrounds as well, which is again a very different pace and a very different way of working. So that was a huge cultural change, frankly. I mean, there's a lot to learn, no question. Um, but it's a different mentality, and so that was one. I'd say another dimension was, and this is just probably back to age. I'm someone who spent 25, 30 years going to an office every day, and my connections with people, colleagues, clients, whatever, were mostly that way. And now suddenly I'm working from home most of the time. There is an office, but it's an hour and a half away, and not many people are showing up there anyway. So it's just a whole different way of working. So those were challenges. Not necessarily bad things, but probably a bigger change than I might have thought or assumed.
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a, it's a weird artifact of like in-group, out-group biases, right? Where so much of behavioral science is, well, everybody else is doing things really, really differently than we're doing things. So there's sort of an assumption of homogeny within the behavioral science community. But then when you switch lenses and you actually look at what people in the behavioral science community are doing, you know, there can be large disconnects, right? I've had public arguments with people, who sort of say, well, we can just apply the principles of things that worked in the lab and then confidently assert them in the world. And I'm like, no, no, like there needs to be pilots, there need to be evaluations, there need to be experiments. Just because it worked there doesn't mean it works here. And that's, I think from the outside, people are look at both of us and say, hey, we're both behavioral scientists. But from the inside, you're going, wow, these are really, really,
Yeah,
really
it could be a
different
very different
approaches.
mentality and a very different approach. And yeah, and again, standards, and some of this is coming from who you're working with, right? Governments, philanthropies, etc. You know, different timelines, different standards of proof and evidence, etc. Whereas businesses, I mean, it obviously varies. The culture at a pharma company is usually very different than the culture at PepsiCo. But, there is just um, a different comfort level, different realities and so forth. And that's actually a lot of what, I think the experience at Bit and the experience, I guess it added another dimension for me, and it kind of leads me to where I am today, which is to some degree trying to serve as a bridge between the business world and the behavioral science world. So on the one hand, there's the very obvious thing that, I think has driven me for a long time, which is, I just want to get more business people excited, knowledgeable about behavioral science. And, there's obviously the debates of, oh my gosh, they're going to cut corners and not do this right. And, I understand some of the validity, I understand and accept the validity in some of that argument, but I kind of lean more towards the side of the equation or the continuum of, hey, I want people excited about it. I know they're not going to be as rigorous as academics, but I still think there's good, and I want to engage with them, hopefully steer them in positive directions, have an opportunity to influence them um, there. And then there's the other side, and I think this is where the bit part may have helped me or helped me realize is that, I think there's a lot of behavioral scientists who come from from one perspective and could use some help and education in just trying to understand how best to be effective in business environments. Um, recognizing that no two companies are identical, of course, but there are realities around, you know, accessing budget, resources, working constructively with business leaders, things of that nature, um, that, I think ultimately will help serve the greater good because you'll have more really talented, bright people that are also able to work in these other contexts and not be limited to only working in a very structured context with government ministries and things like that. Hope that made some sense. I wasn't just
No, it makes a
rambling.
ton of sense. And again, I think, it is that sort of the dual role that we all have to play in terms of improving our own community while also improving its relations. It's going all the way back to your interest in the foreign service, right? There's a sense in which we need to both improve America and also improve America's relationship with others, right? Those are
Exactly.
and those are related, but sometimes differently modal, and it can be hard to switch between the two. But you've carved out, I mean, you're at an interesting stage in your career in terms of trying to bridge some of those things. Your work with BeScy, you're teaching MBAs, you're doing these things to sort of like try and get people, a little bit closer uh, together on those things. And so as you think about this third act a little bit and sort of this place where you're starting to spend more time, where do you see that going? You know,
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it does all kind of serve this larger vision, I'll call it, of kind of being that bridge, so to speak. Fortunately, I'm at a point in my life and career um, where I do think I can kind of prioritize. I don't know if you want to call it giving back, but at least trying to be a positive force, and it's not driven particularly by the financial side. So yeah, I think on the one hand, I want to continue engaging with business people and trying to get more of them engaged and excited and help them take some initial steps, help coach them on applying behavioral science to their challenges, whether that's human resources or compliance or insights or whatever it may be. So to me, doing some occasional consulting projects fits with that, both uh, proof of concept and also to keep myself hopefully sharp and really, in the game in terms of understanding some of these realities I'm talking about. Um, I think teaching does that, and I teach or I guest lecture and sometimes teach both at some at the master's programs in behavioral science. But importantly, I really do want to reach out to executive ed and MBA and others. So I am trying to reach you know, mainstream business people and engage them. And then the BeScy side, kind of by definition, it's people who have an interest in the field and just really trying to connect them with each other first and foremost and kind of help them connect and point people towards resources, whether that's helping them on a career path or pointing them towards people that I know are doing interesting work, and that might be able to help them on a particular type of challenge. So I've really enjoyed that. And at this point, it is kind of a little of all of those things, between the consulting and the teaching and the volunteering with BeScy and the and some writing, and kind of hopefully that all adds up to fulfilling, challenging, and something that also is having a positive impact. So that's kind of all those goals at once, if I can make those happen.
well, I can't speak to whether or not it's enjoyable for you, but it is having a positive impact. I mean, I think obviously you've had a great impact on the field over the course of your career and continue to do so
Thank you.
now. And thank you so much for sort of walking us through what I think has been a very evolutionary sort of like, how did you get here version of things. It is a very, you and I exist from a different world where you couldn't, we didn't say the words applied behavioral science at the beginning of our career, and there was no undergraduate degree, and there was no sort of, and I think it helps to have people like you because it is a reminder to people that this has not been that long, right? You're still quite
Yeah.
young, right? I think sometimes people, younger behavioral scientists, it's very easy to trick yourself into thinking like this is a very, we've got it all figured out and we've been doing it for 50 years and we're, it's like architecture or something. And I'm like, no, no, like the Greeks had that figured out. We've had a long time to iterate. This one's a little newer.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, pretty much when I do a guest lecture and so forth, and I do make a point of kind of telling, a much quicker version than we just went through of my story, kind of to make the point that, I think for a lot of people, certainly our age, it kind of stems from a problem or a challenge that they saw out there. And for me, it was this kind of gap between claimed and actual behavior, the limitations I was seeing in asking people questions and just taking at face value what they told me. That is kind of what led me. And some of the best conversations I have with people are folks, whatever field they're in, they kind of see something that they feel doesn't make sense. Whether it's, hey, this is the way we've been doing it and it's continually not working, or, or just intuitively, I know this isn't the way things should work. And, you know, I like that because I think, I mean, there's nothing wrong with coming at it from a purely academic standpoint of, hey, this is what I want to study. I'm fascinated with human beings. Um, but I think a lot of the progress in the field is also going to come from people, who are managing teams and seeing continual problems that traditional tools and ways of working aren't solving. And that's where I see a lot of the opportunity for us. Not saying throw out your performance reviews and incentive systems, but maybe there's an extra layer or dimension that we can give you, a new way of thinking about the problem, and maybe there's something, a refreshed way that might help you move the needle on something that you've been struggling with.
and
So
it really is
that kind
about
of that's what's exciting and interesting to me is when that light bulb goes off for those folks.
and relieving that struggle is what we're all about. Well, thank you for joining us on an N of one and giving us a preview of sort of your story and pushing deep on the story with me and also for the work that you're doing. I mean, I think it genuinely does help the field and help bring us together as we start to look at, how we can expand our impact. Nobody gets in this to not, make a difference, right? The reason you go into applied behavioral science versus academic behavioral science is because you like the applied part and you want there to be outcomes and you want things to
Exactly.
change. And I think a lot of people get frustrated not knowing how to do that. So having guides like you who have been impactful, who have created change, who have been able to do that other places, I think is a really valuable thing. Uh,
Thank you.
so
That's inspirational for me. So keep me energized for a couple more years, I hope.
yeah, well, we hope you'll stick with us for a while. It's don't ride off into the sunset quite yet, Scott.
No, not planning to at the
Oh,
moment.
good. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you coming in one, and we'll be looking forward to what you do next.
Thanks, Matt. My pleasure.